8 in the morning. The USS Mason was already deep inside the Strait of Hormuz. The destroyer was conducting what should have been a standard transit of the world's most volatile choke point. But today, the automated identification signals of every commercial tanker in the area had suddenly gone dark. The crew stared at digital displays that showed a ghost sea where there should have been dozens of ships. The unanswered question hung in the recycled air of the bridge. Where did a fleet of 200,000-ton tankers go in the middle of a clear morning? The sun sat heavy over the jagged cliffs of the Musandam Peninsula. The humidity was already 90%. Heat haze distorted the horizon. It turned the distant Iranian coastline into a shimmering, unstable mirage. The USS Mason was a billion-dollar machine of war. It was designed to fight entire nations. Yet, in this narrow strip of water, it felt exposed. Deep inside the ship, the Combat Information Center was bathed in a dim blue light. This was the brain of the destroyer. Operators sat in front of glowing consoles. They monitored the air, the surface, and the depths. The air was cool and smelled of ozone. It was a sharp contrast to the baking heat outside. Commander David Miller stood behind the tactical action officer. He watched the main display. The lack of commercial traffic was more than an anomaly. It was a warning. For 20 years, the strait had followed a predictable rhythm. Tankers moved in and out like clockwork. They provided the lifeblood of the global economy. To see the lanes empty was like seeing a busy highway suddenly cleared for a motorcade. 10 miles to the north, 40 Iranian fast attack craft sat motionless. They were tucked into the jagged shadows of the limestone coves. These were not large ships. They were small, fast. Each was armed with heavy machine guns and multiple rocket launchers. Some carried anti-ship missiles that could punch through the aluminum skin of a destroyer. Their crews were silent. Their engines were warm. They were not waiting for a signal to fire. They were waiting for a signal to move. Inside the Iranian command boat, a senior officer checked his watch. He did not look at a radar screen. He looked at the water. He knew exactly where the American ship was. He knew its speed. He knew its heading. He knew that the rules of engagement for the Americans were strict. They would not fire unless they were fired upon. He intended to test exactly how close he could get before that changed. Back on the USS Mason, the surface search radar operator leaned forward. His headset crackled with static. A single yellow dot had appeared on his screen. It was small. It was fast. It was coming from the direction of the Iranian coast. Bridge. Combat. I have a surface contact. Bearing 010. Range 12 miles. Speed 30 knots and increasing. Commander Miller did not look away from the screen. Classify the contact. Working on it, sir. It is small. High speed. It is not broadcasting a civilian signal. Another dot appeared. Then 3 more. Then a dozen. They were blooming on the screen like a digital infection. They were emerging from the coast in a coordinated line. They were not wandering. They were intercepting. On the bridge, the lookouts raised their binoculars. They scanned the shimmering horizon. The heat haze made it difficult to see. But then, the first white wake appeared. It was a thin line of foam cutting through the green water. Behind it, another wake. And another. The ship felt the vibration of its own engines as the helmsman maintained a steady course. The USS Mason was committed to its path. To turn now would be a sign of weakness. To speed up would be a sign of fear. They had to maintain the professional mask of a neutral vessel in international waters. The number of contacts on the radar hit 40. They were no longer in a line. They were spreading out. They were forming a wide crescent moon. The tips of that crescent were moving faster than the center. They were beginning to wrap around the American destroyer. Commander Miller picked up the internal radio. His voice was calm. It was the practiced calm of a man who had spent his life preparing for a moment he hoped would never happen. Set Condition 2 across the ship. Man the small caliber weapons. Inform 5 Fleet that we are being shadowed by a large number of fast attack craft. Remind the crew, we do not point weapons unless ordered. We do not fire unless fired upon. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 8:00 to 5 in the morning. The horizon was no longer empty. Through the high-powered binoculars on the bridge, the white wakes looked like teeth. The 40 Iranian boats were moving at 40 knots. They were closing the distance with aggressive precision. Commander Miller stood by the bridge wing. He could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of dozens of outboard engines. It was a sound that did not belong in the middle of an ocean. It sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. The vibration felt low in his chest. The bridge officer spoke. "Captain, lead contact is at 2,000 yards. They are splitting into 3 groups." Miller did not move. "Understood. Bridge to bridge. Channel 16. Warn them off." The communications officer keyed the handset. His voice was steady, but fast. "Unidentified craft on bearing 010. This is United States ship Mason. You are approaching a coalition warship operating in international waters. Your intentions are unclear. Alter your course immediately or be subject to defensive measures." The radio crackled with static. There was no verbal response. Instead, the lead boat turned sharply. It began a high-speed run across the Mason's bow. This was a classic provocation. It was a game of chicken played with 10,000 tons of steel. The small boat skipped over the swells, appearing and disappearing behind walls of spray. Inside the lead Iranian boat, the commander gripped the metal railing. He was close enough now to see the sailors on the Mason. He could see the heavy machine guns mounted on the railings. He saw the barrels were pointed up. They were not aimed at him. Yet, he signaled his pilots with a hand gesture. They began to tighten the circle. The Iranian commander did not want a war today. He wanted to see how the Americans handled the pressure. He wanted to see if they would break their own rules. He knew that one nervous sailor with a twitching finger could change the history of the region. He watched the massive gray hull of the destroyer tower over his small craft. It was an intimidating sight. He ordered his group to close within 500 meters. On the Mason, the tension was thick. The gunners' mates at the 50 caliber mounts stood ready. Their hands were near the grips. Their eyes were locked on the small, fast-moving targets. The boats were so close now that the spray from their wakes was hitting the Mason's hull. The crew could see the faces of the Iranian sailors. They could see the rocket launchers mounted on the decks of the fast boats. The tactical officer reported from the center of the bridge. "They are inside 1,000 yards. They are surrounding us. We are being boxed in." The USS Mason was a massive ship. But in this formation, it was becoming a prisoner. The 40 boats were not just shadowing. They were forming a literal ring of steel and fiberglass. They were forcing the destroyer to maintain its speed and heading. To turn now would mean a collision with multiple targets at once. "Steady as she goes," Miller ordered. "Do not give them the satisfaction of a course change. Maintain 18 knots." The destroyer plowed forward. It felt like a giant moving through a crowd of children. But these children were armed with high explosives. The bridge crew watched the radar screen. The 40 yellow dots had become a solid circle around the center of the display. Suddenly, the radar operator shouted from the darkness of the Combat Information Center. "Bridge, combat. We have a new problem. Multiple high-speed air contacts launching from the mainland, bearing 045. Time to intercept is 3 minutes." Commander Miller looked at the sky. The situation had just shifted from a surface harassment to a coordinated strike profile. 8:00 to 8 in the morning. The Iranian command boat, Commander Abbas Bagheri, stood on the swaying deck of the lead fast attack craft. He did not wear a life jacket. He gripped the salt-crusted rail with one hand and a radio handset with the other. Behind him, the 3,000 horsepower outboards roared. They kicked up a rooster tail of white water that soaked his uniform. He looked up at the USS Mason. From his low position on the water, the destroyer looked like a mountain of steel. It was indifferent to the waves. He watched the ship's sensors. The large gray panels of the radar system were visible on the superstructure. He knew they were being tracked with terrifying precision. He also knew that the Americans were bound by their own laws. They were a giant that was forbidden from stepping on an ant. Bagheri spoke to his radio operator, signaled the flight leader. "Tell them to maintain their approach. We want the Americans to see the full weight of our presence." High above, 2 Iranian F-4 Phantom jets descended through the haze. Their engines left thick black trails against the blue sky. They were aging aircraft, but their missiles were still lethal. They moved at 500 knots. They We're closing the distance to the destroyer in seconds. The radio on the command boat crackled. It was the American voice again. It sounded calm. Too calm. The American officer spoke. Iranian small craft. This is United States ship Mason. We are operating in international waters in accordance with international law. Your aircraft are approaching at a high rate of speed. This is an unsafe and unprofessional maneuver. Break off your approach immediately. Bagheri smiled. He keyed his own radio. United States ship Mason. This is the Islamic Republic Guard Corps Navy. You are the ones who are far from home. You are operating in a zone of high tension. Your presence is the provocation. We are conducting a routine exercise. The sky and the sea belong to those who live here. The American response was immediate. Commander, we are not here to argue geography. Your aircraft are in a dive profile toward my ship. If they do not alter course, I will be forced to take defensive action to protect my crew. Do you copy? Bagheri did not answer immediately. He watched the white domes of the American defensive guns. They were moving. They were twitching. They were following the path of the jets overhead. This was the moment of maximum risk. If the pilots stayed on their course for 10 more seconds, the American computer systems might take over. He looked at the Mason. He saw a sailor on the bridge wing, looking back at him through binoculars. For a brief second, their eyes met across 500 meters of churning water. Bagheri spoke into the radio to his pilots. Level off, 500 feet. Pass over the ship. Do not lock your radars. We have shown them the sky. The jets roared overhead. The sound hit the Mason like a physical blow. The deck of the destroyer vibrated. The black smoke from the Phantoms drifted over the American bridge. Bagheri turned back to the Mason. The air threat had passed, but the circle of boats remained. The real test was just beginning. He signaled his group to close the gap even further. Move in, Bagheri ordered his pilot. I want to be close enough to see the color of the captain's eyes. The fast boats surged forward. The distance dropped from 500 meters to 300, then 200. The morning was becoming a very small place. 8:10 in the morning. The center of the Strait of Hormuz, the circle of boats, was no longer just a formation. It was a moving wall of fiberglass and steel. The 40 Iranian craft had accelerated to 45 knots. They began a series of high-speed maneuvers known as crossing the bow. They moved in pairs. One boat would surge ahead of the USS Mason. It would cut sharply across the path of the destroyer. Then it would circle back and do it again. The wake from the small boats was hitting the Mason from every direction. The destroyer began to roll slightly in the confused sea created by 40 different engines. On the bridge, the deck tilted. The crew braced themselves against consoles and railings. Commander Miller looked down at the nearest boat. It was less than 100 meters away. He could see the Iranian gunner. The man was standing behind a heavy machine gun. He was not aiming it yet, but his hands were on the grips. The gunner was wearing a green bandana. He looked young. He looked excited. The tactical action officer spoke through the internal circuit. Captain, this is combat. The maneuvers are becoming more aggressive. They are restricting our ability to maneuver. If we have to turn to avoid a hazard, we will hit them. Miller replied. I am aware. What is the status of the 5-inch gun? The officer answered. The gun is in standby. Fire control has a track on the lead boat, but the target is so close that the minimum range is a factor. If we fire, the blast alone will destroy several of them. This was the trap. The Iranian boats were using their small size and high speed as a shield. They were so close that the heavy weapons of the destroyer were almost useless. It was like a man trying to fight off a swarm of bees with a sledgehammer. The USS Mason was built to kill ships miles away. It was not built for a street fight at 80 meters. On the bridge wing, a young sailor held a flare gun. He looked at the captain. He was waiting for the order to fire a warning. Miller shook his head. Not yet. A flare could be misinterpreted as a muzzle flash in this light. We keep our cool. Inside the Iranian group, the energy was different. The pilots were screaming over the roar of their engines. They were competing to see who could get closest to the American hull. For them, this was a display of courage. They were the ones defying a superpower. Every time a boat crossed the bow of the Mason, a cheer went up across the radio net. Commander Bagheri watched from the center of the swarm. He saw the American sailors on the deck. He saw their discipline. It frustrated him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the destroyer to change its course. He wanted to prove that he could control the movement of a billion-dollar warship. Bagheri spoke into his radio. Group 2. Close the distance to 50 meters. Maintain speed. Do not let them breathe. The two boats on the port side veered inward. They were now so close that the spray from their hulls was drenching the American lookouts. The sound of the outboard motors was a constant, screaming roar. It filled the air. It made communication on the bridge difficult. The American tactical officer's voice rose in pitch. "Captain, they are inside 50 meters. This is no longer a shadow. This is an attempt to force a collision." Miller felt the vibration of the Mason's engines. He could feel the power of his ship. He knew he could crush any of these boats in a second, but he also knew the cost of that second. The captain spoke. "Maintain course and speed. Do not waver. If they want to hit us, they will have to be the ones to do it." A boat suddenly swerved. It missed the Mason's bow by less than 10 meters. The crew on the bridge held their breath. The silence that followed was broken only by the screaming of the engines. The game of chicken was no longer a game. It was a countdown. 8:12 in the morning. The sound was the first thing that changed. The high-pitched whine of the 40 outboard engines had merged into a single, physical wall of noise. It was no longer a series of separate boats. It was a vibrating cloud of sound that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the bridge windows. The air smelled of burnt gasoline and salt spray. On the USS Mason, the electronic warfare suite began to react. In the dim light of the Combat Information Center, the electronic warfare supervisor watched his screen turn into a mess of strobe lines. The Iranians were not just using boats, they were now using land-based jammers. From the nearby islands, they were trying to blind the Mason's short-range navigation radars. The supervisor spoke into his headset. "Bridge.
Containment on deck 7. Reroute auxiliary power now."
Acknowledged, Commander. Initiating stabilization sequence for Gamma 12.
Commander Miller gripped the edge of the chart table. He could feel the ship pushing back. The Mason was now emitting a massive amount of electronic energy. It was a silent battle of invisible waves. The air around the ship's masts was thick with radiation. On the bridge, the digital displays flickered and then stabilized as the ship's computers fought off the jamming. "They are committed now," Miller said to his executive officer. "This is not just a demonstration. They are trying to create a tactical vacuum. They want us to lose track of where they are." Outside, the swarm was closing to within 30 meters. This was the absolute limit of safety. At this distance, the wake of the destroyer was creating massive waves that tossed the Iranian boats like toys. The Iranian pilots had to use every bit of their skill to keep from being sucked into the Mason's massive propellers. Commander Bagheri sat in his command boat. He felt the spray soaking his face. He could see the rivets on the Mason's hull. He could see the rust streaks near the waterline. He was so close that he had to look almost straight up to see the American bridge. He knew his jammers were working. He saw the American radar dishes stop their smooth rotation and begin to jerk back and forth. Bagheri grabbed his radio. All units, close to 20 meters. We will ride their wake. If they speed up, we speed up. If they slow down, we swarm the stern." This was the maximum buildup. Both sides had committed their primary assets. The Americans had their electronic defenses at full power. The Iranians had their entire local fleet in a tight, suffocating knot around the destroyer. There was no room left for error. A single mechanical failure or a single wave at the wrong angle would cause a collision. On the Mason's deck, the security teams were now in full gear. They wore heavy ceramic body armor and helmets. They held their rifles at the low ready. They were trained to look for small details. They watched the hands of the Iranians. They looked for the glint of a rocket, propelled grenade launcher. They looked for anyone reaching for a detonator. The tension was so high that the air felt heavy. Nobody was talking on the bridge now. They only communicated through short, professional bursts of data. Every man was locked into his role. They were waiting for the one thing that would break the stalemate. The tactical officer looked at Miller. "Sir, we are boxed in. We have no clear water in any direction. If we maintain this course, we will hit the narrowest part of the channel in 2 minutes. There is a shallow reef to our starboard. We have to turn." Miller looked at the swarm. "And if we turn into them." "Correct, sir." The USS Mason was running out of ocean. The Iranians knew it. They were waiting for the turn. They were waiting for the moment the giant was forced to move. 8:13 in the morning. The edge of the reef was 1 mile away. The water was changing color. It was turning from a deep blue to a pale, sickly green. The USS Mason was running out of deep water. It had to turn port, but the port side was a solid wall of Iranian engines and steel. Commander Miller looked at the navigator. "Time to the shoal." The navigator's voice was tight. 60 seconds to the safety limit. "Sir." Miller turned to the tactical officer. "Enable the close-in weapon system. Manual override. Target the lead boats on the port side." In the Combat Information Center, the operator flipped a guarded switch. On the deck of the Mason, the 2 white domes of the Gatling guns began to move. They did not move smoothly. They snapped from target to target with robotic speed. The barrels began to spin. They created a low, electric hum that could be felt through the deck. The Iranian boats reacted instantly. They saw the guns move. They saw the barrels level at them. Inside the Iranian command boat, the alarm for a fire control radar sounded. It was a high-pitched, steady scream. Bagheri's pilot looked at him. His face was pale. They were now being tracked by a system that could fire 75 rounds of tungsten every second. Bagheri did not flinch. "Hold the line. They are bluffing." 8, 13, and 30 seconds in the morning. One boat on the port side did not hold. It was a smaller craft, further back in the pack. The pilot was young. He saw the massive guns of the destroyer, pointing directly at his chest. He panicked. The small boat suddenly veered. It broke formation. It did not turn away. It turned inward. It accelerated. It was a suicide charge toward the Mason's port quarter. "Vampire! Vampire!" Small craft inbound. The lookout screamed. Miller saw the boat. It was moving at 50 knots. It was 300 meters away. 200 meters. The spray from its hull was a white blur. "Gunner's mate. Warning shots. Cross his bow. Now." The 50 caliber machine gun on the port side barked. 3 round bursts. The tracers were bright red even in the morning sun. They splashed into the water 10 meters in front of the charging boat. The Iranian pilot did not stop. He leaned lower behind his windscreen. 100 meters. The Mason's bridge was silent. Miller stood perfectly still. His hands were behind his back. He was counting the seconds. If that boat hit the hull, the explosion could take out the ship's steering. If he fired to destroy it, the war started today. 80 meters. The Iranian boat was so close that the Mason's wake was tossing it high, into the air. It was skipping over the water. It was barely in control. Inside the Combat Information Center, the finger of the gunner hovered over the fire button. He was waiting for the word. His eyes were fixed on the thermal image of the boat. 50 meters, the tactical officer whispered. The charging boat hit a massive swell from the Mason's propellers. It launched into the air. For a split second, it was level with the deck of the destroyer. The pilot and the American gunner looked at each other. 8:14 in the morning. The Iranian boat reached the crest of the wake. It was a missile of fiberglass and fuel. Then, the screaming whine of its triple outboards did not just stop. It shattered. A gout of black smoke and orange flame erupted from the stern of the small craft. Metal fragments hissed into the water. The boat did not explode, but the propulsion was gone. It hit the water with a bone-shaking thud. It was no longer a charging predator. It was a dead weight, and it was drifting directly into the path of the USS Mason's steel bow. Bridge. Combat. Lead boat has lost power. It is dead in the water. Range 40 meters. Commander Miller saw it happen. The physics were simple and brutal. The Mason was moving at 18 knots. 10,000 tons of displacement cannot stop in 100 feet. If he did nothing, the destroyer would slice the small boat in half. The fuel would ignite. The Iranian sailors would be sucked into the intake of the cooling systems, or chewed by the screws. Inside the Iranian command boat, Bagheri froze. He saw his men bobbing in the path of the giant. He screamed into his radio, but there was no one to answer. The damaged boat was silent. The two men on board were scrambling for life jackets. They were looking up at the gray wall of the Mason. They were waiting to die. 8, 14, and 30 seconds in the morning. All engines stop, Miller commanded. Full rise on the mount. Do not fire. The Mason's bridge crew moved. With frantic efficiency, the helmsman fought the wheel. The destroyer began to groan as the massive turbines reversed. The vibration was immense. It felt like the ship was trying to tear itself apart. The Iranian swarm scattered. The discipline of the circle broke. The other boats veered away to avoid the wake of the slowing destroyer. Bagheri's boat was forced to turn hard to starboard. He watched the gap between the Mason's bow and the dead boat close. 30 meters, 20 meters, 30 meters, 20 meters. The air was filled with the smell of scorched metal and the sound of the Mason's emergency sirens. On the deck of the destroyer, the security team looked down. They were no longer aiming at the Iranians. They were watching a tragedy in slow motion. 8:15 in the morning. The USS Mason's bow missed the Iranian boat by less than 5 meters. The displacement wave from the destroyer pushed the small craft aside. It tossed it like a piece of driftwood. The boat spun wildly in the churn. It took on water. It tilted dangerously to one side, but it did not sink. The Mason came to a shuddering halt. The water around the ship was white with foam. The 40 Iranian boats were no longer a swarm. They were a disorganized cluster of confused pilots. Bagheri's boat drifted to a stop 100 meters away. He picked up his binoculars. He looked at the American bridge. He expected to see the guns leveled at his men. He expected the Americans to take advantage of the chaos. Instead, he saw the USS Mason holding its position. The white domes of the defensive guns had moved. They were no longer pointing at his fleet. They were pointing at the sky. The silence that followed was more intense than the noise of the engines. For the first time in 20 minutes, the only sound was the wind and the lapping of waves against hulls. Miller stood on the bridge wing. He did not look at the other boats. He looked at the two men in the water. "Bridge to combat," Miller said. His voice was thick with the adrenaline of the last 60 seconds. Report status of the Iranian survivors. The pivot had occurred. The threat of war had been replaced by a crisis of survival. 8:16 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. The USS Mason was a motionless mountain of steel in the green water. The massive vibration of the emergency backing maneuver was finally fading. A thick cloud of gray smoke from the destroyer's stacks drifted slowly over the surface. It smelled of burnt fuel and salt. Commander Miller watched the Iranian boat through his binoculars. It was low in the water. One sailor was frantically bailing water with a small plastic bucket. The other was on his knees. He was trying to restart the engine. He was pulling a manual starter cord over and over. The cord kept snapping back. The man looked exhausted. He looked terrified. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was frozen. The tactical officer spoke into the internal circuit. "Captain, the other 39 boats are reforming. They are moving to a flanking position 500 meters out. They are not retreating. They are watching us," Miller responded. "Maintain our position. Do not lock on to the new formation. They are as confused as we are. Let them figure out what just happened." On the Iranian command boat, Commander Bagheri was breathing hard. He looked at the wreckage of his lead boat. He looked at the American ship. He had spent years studying the Americans. He expected them to be cold. He expected them to use this pause to maneuver for a better shot. Instead, the giant had simply stopped to keep from crushing his men. Bagheri spoke to his radio operator. His voice was a low growl. "Tell the others to hold their positions. Do not approach the American ship. They are allowing us to recover our men. If anyone fires, they will answer to me." A moment of absolute silence followed. It was the strangest feeling Bagheri had ever experienced in these waters. Usually, the strait was filled with noise and posturing. Now, it was just the sound of the wind and the ocean. He picked up his binoculars. He saw the American captain on the bridge wing. The man was not looking at the fleet of docked 40 boats. He was looking at the two men in the sinking craft. Miller reached for the bridge-to-bridge radio. He did not use the standard warning script this time. The captain spoke into the handset. Iranian commander, this is United States ship Mason. Your men are in the water. We are standing by. We will not interfere with your recovery operation. Confirm. There was a long pause. The static on the radio seemed louder than usual. Everyone on the bridge was held in a state of suspended animation. Bagheri's hand shook slightly as he keyed the mic. United States ship Mason. This is Bagheri. I confirm. We are moving to recover our personnel. Do not move your ship. Understood, Miller replied. We are holding position. The Iranian command boat moved forward. It was a slow and cautious approach. The other 39 boats stayed back in a wide circle. They watched with their engines idling. On the Mason, the gunners' mates kept their hands near their weapons. They did not aim. They watched as Bagheri's crew reached down and pulled their comrades from the swamped boat. One of the rescued Iranian sailors looked up at the Mason as he was pulled onto the command deck. He was soaked and shivering. He raised a hand. It was not a salute. It was not a gesture of defiance. It was just a brief acknowledgement of life. But the peace was fragile. The bridge of the Mason was still a combat zone. The tactical officer's voice broke the silence. Captain, we have a new problem. Iranian shore batteries on Keshem Island have just illuminated us with long-range targeting radar. They are not part of this recovery. They are looking for a weapons lock. 8:18 in the morning. The sound inside the Combat Information Center was different now. It was a rhythmic, high-pitched chirp. This was the sound of a land-based radar system in search and track mode. Bridge. Combat. We have a solid lock. On the main display, a red line extended from the coast of Keshem Island directly to the center of the USS Mason. Iranian silkworm battery on Keshem. They are painted. Repeat, we are painted. The tactical officer looked at Commander Miller. His face was illuminated by the red glow of the threat warning. Sir, the Aegis system is requesting permission to engage the source of the illumination. If they launch, we have less than 40 seconds. Miller did not hesitate. Negate. Override the auto-engage. If we fire at the mainland, this escalates beyond the strait. We hold. The captain stepped back onto the bridge wing. He looked at Bagheri's command boat. It was less than 50 meters away. The Iranian commander was busy overseeing the transfer of the soaked sailors. He did not seem to know about the radar lock from the shore, or perhaps he did not have control over it. Miller picked up the radio handset. Commander Bagheri, this is Miller on the Mason. Your shore batteries on Keshem Island have a weapons lock on my ship. I am telling you now, my automated systems are seconds away from returning fire on that battery. If they do not drop that lock, the situation will be out of my hands. You must signal them. Bagheri looked up at the Mason. He looked toward the northern horizon, toward the invisible batteries hidden in the limestone cliffs. His face went pale. He had achieved his goal. He had tested the Americans. He had recovered his men. He did not want to be the reason a missile strike leveled a coastal village. Bagheri grabbed his own long-range radio. He screamed into it. He was not using the professional tone of a commander now. He was a man trying to stop a disaster. He was calling the regional command center on the mainland. He was telling them the exercise was over. He was telling them the Americans had shown restraint. 8:19 in the morning, the chirp in the Combat Information Center stopped. The red line on the display blinked and then vanished. Bridge. Combat. Radar lock has been dropped. They are back in search mode. The threat is downgraded. The collective exhale on the bridge was almost audible. Miller wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. The morning sun was now high enough to be blinding. The heat was becoming oppressive. On the water, the 40 Iranian boats began to change their behavior. They were no longer forming a circle. They were no longer crossing the bow. They were reforming into a loose column. It was the formation used for a standard escort. Bagheri's boat moved away from the Mason's hull. He stood on the deck and looked at Miller one last time. He did not salute, but he nodded. A single, sharp movement of the head. It was the only acknowledgement that both men had just prevented a war. Bagheri spoke into his radio. United States ship Mason. We are clear of your vessel. We will maintain a distance of 1 mile. For the remainder of your transit, the strait is open. Miller watched the command boat peel away. Copy that, Bagheri. We are resuming our transit. 8:22 in the morning. The USS Mason began to move. The engines hummed. The vibration returned to the deck. But it was a steady, comforting rhythm. The destroyer plowed through the green water. The swarm followed at a distance. They were no longer hunters. They were witnesses. The ship moved toward the open water. The cliffs of the Muzandam Peninsula began to recede into the haze. The radar screen began to fill with the yellow dots of commercial tankers. The tankers were turning their transponders back on. The ghost sea was becoming real again. The crisis had reached its peak and passed. But for the crew of the Mason, the silence of the morning still felt like a weight. 8:25 in the morning. The USS Mason increased its speed to 25 knots. The sound of the turbines changed from a low hum to a powerful, rhythmic thrum. The wake behind the destroyer stretched out for miles. It was a straight, white scar on the surface of the green water. On the bridge, the physical pressure of the last hour was finally beginning to lift. The officers and sailors did not relax their posture, but the quality of the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of men waiting for an explosion. It was the silence of professionals finishing a job. Commander Miller stood at the center of the bridge. He watched the last of the 40 Iranian boats peel away. They were heading north toward the rugged coastline of the mainland. They moved in small groups of 3 and 4. From this distance, they no longer looked like a swarm of predators. They looked like fishing boats returning after a long night at sea. Bridge, combat. The last of the fast attack craft has cleared 5 miles, the tactical officer reported. Air tracks are also turning back toward the mainland. The airspace is clear. Miller nodded. Understood. Revert to condition. 3 across the ship. Secure the small caliber weapons. Tell the crew they did a fine job today. Their restraint saved more than just this ship. The order was passed through the ship's internal speakers. Across the decks, sailors began to step back from their weapons. The gunners' mates at the 50 caliber mounts unclipped their harnesses. They rubbed their eyes. Their hands were stiff from gripping the spade grips for so long. There was no cheering. There was no celebratory clapping. They simply began the routine work of cleaning and securing their gear. They had faced a swarm of 40 boats and a pair of fighter jets without firing a single shot. They knew that in the world of modern naval warfare, that was the ultimate victory. Inside the Iranian command boat, Commander Bagheri sat on a metal bench. His uniform was soaked with salt spray. He watched the USS Mason grow smaller on the horizon. His own men were quiet. The 2 sailors, who had been rescued from the sinking boat, were wrapped in blankets. They were drinking water from plastic bottles. One of them was staring at the American ship with a look of profound confusion. Bagheri knew his superiors would have questions. He would have to explain why the exercise ended without a clear victory. He would have to explain why he chose to coordinate with the American captain to save his men. But as he looked at the survivors, he knew he had made the right choice. He had proven that he could close the distance. He had proven that he could box in a destroyer. He did not need to prove that he could die. The USS Mason reached the eastern exit of the strait. To the south, the lighthouse on Great Quoin Island stood as a silent sentinel. Beyond it lay the deep, open water of the Gulf of Oman. The commercial tankers were now everywhere. The radar screen was crowded with the steady, predictable dots of global trade. The Solar Star, a massive crude carrier, passed the Mason at a distance of 3 miles. Its crew likely had no idea how close the world had come to a secondary oil crisis in the last 30 minutes. Navigator, set a course for the North Arabian Sea, Miller ordered. Maintain 18 knots. I want a full transcript of all bridge-to-bridge communications on my desk in 1 hour. Aye, sir, the navigator replied. The morning sun was now a brilliant, scorching white. It burned away the last of the heat haze. The horizon was sharp and clear. The USS Mason moved forward into the blue. The ship was safe. The crew was safe. The Strait of Hormuz was behind them. The crisis was over. The analysis was about to begin. 3 in the afternoon, 300 miles south of the Strait of Hormuz, the USS Mason moved through the calm waters of the Arabian Sea. The intense heat of the morning had given way to a steady, dry wind. On the surface, the ship looked exactly as it had 8 hours earlier. The gray paint was clean. The guns were centered. The radar panels continued their silent, rhythmic search. But inside the ship, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the morning's events. Commander Miller sat in his cabin. The room was small and functional. On his desk was a stack of digital printouts. These were the sensor logs from the engagement. They showed the exact movements of all 40 Iranian boats. The data was cold. It did not show the spray of the water or the fear in the eyes of the young Iranian pilot. It only showed vectors, speeds, and distances. There was a knock on the door. The executive officer stepped inside. He carried 2 mugs of coffee. He set one on the desk. "The crew is settling down, sir," the XO said, "but the questions are starting. They want to know if this was a one-time event or the new normal." Miller rubbed his eyes. It was a calibration. Bagheri wasn't trying to start a war. He was measuring us. He wanted to see how far our rules of engagement would stretch before they snapped. He wanted to know if we would choose the ship or the mission. The XO leaned against the bulkhead. We chose both, but it was close. 5 seconds later, and we would have been picking up pieces of fiberglass and bodies from our engine intakes. "He knew that," Miller replied. "That is the part that worries me. He was willing to bet the lives of his men on our discipline. Next time, he might not be the one in the command boat. Next time, it might be someone who wants the explosion." 6 in the evening, Manama, Bahrain. The headquarters of the United States 5th Fleet was a hive of activity. In the secure conference room, senior intelligence analysts stood before a massive wall of screens. They were replaying the footage from the Mason's mast-mounted cameras. The video was crisp. It showed the Iranian swarm in high definition. An analyst pointed to the lead boats. "Look at the hull numbers. These weren't the usual coastal patrol units. These were specialized IRGC units from the southern bases. They were equipped with new jamming hardware we haven't seen in the field yet." The coordination of the land-based radar lock was perfectly timed with the surface approach. This was a synchronized multi-domain test. A rear admiral stood at the back of the room. His arms were crossed. They used the Mason as a training aid. They wanted to see the trigger points of our automated defense systems. And they got what they wanted. They know we will hold fire even when a boat is inside 50 meters. They know we will prioritize the safety of their personnel over our own tactical advantage. 48 hours later. The Pentagon. Washington. The incident was no longer a tactical event. It was a strategic case study. In the basement of the E-Ring, a group of specialists in game theory and naval doctrine sat around a mahogany table. They were not looking at radar tracks. They were looking at the political fallout. The Iranian government had already released a statement. They claimed their heroic navy had successfully escorted a trespassing foreign warship out of their territorial waters. They released edited footage that made it look like the Mason had fled from the swarm. It was a victory for their domestic audience. "It is a paradox," one specialist said. "By choosing not to fire, Commander Miller prevented a war. He showed the strength of American character, but in the eyes of the adversary, he showed a pattern of behavior that can be exploited. Every time we choose restraint, we move the line of what is acceptable just a little bit closer to our hull." The room was silent for a moment. The air conditioning hummed. Thousands of miles away, another destroyer was preparing to enter the strait. "The rules of engagement are the most powerful weapon we have," the specialist continued, "but they only work as long as the other side believes we are willing to break them. Today, the Mason held the line. Tomorrow, the line might not be there." The strategic assessment was clear. The encounter in the strait was not an ending. It was a prologue. The 40 boats had gone back to their coves, but the data they gathered was being programmed into missiles and simulators across the region. 3 days later, 10 in the morning. The USS Mason moved with the grace of a predator that had no need to prove its power. The destroyer had rejoined its carrier strike group in the deep blue of the North Arabian Sea. From the flight deck of the nearby aircraft carrier, the Mason looked small. It looked like a toy floating on a vast and indifferent mirror. But the world now knew better. In the classrooms of the Naval War College in Rhode Island, the 20-minute encounter was already being analyzed frame by frame. The video of the Iranian boat skipping over the wake was being shown to young officers. They were told to look at the guns of the Mason. They were told to notice how the barrels never dipped. They were told to study the restraint of a crew that was seconds away from a nightmare. The strategic assessment was complex. Some experts argued that the United States had shown a dangerous level of hesitation. They believed that by not firing, the Navy had invited more aggression. Others argued the opposite. They believed that the USS Mason had won a significant psychological victory. By refusing to be baited into a lopsided slaughter, the Americans had maintained the moral high ground. They had preserved the fragile peace of a global choke point. In a small office overlooking the harbor in Bandar Abbas, Commander Bagheri sat at his desk. He was no longer wearing his salt-stained uniform. He was in a clean, pressed suit. On his computer screen, he watched the same footage. He saw the moment his engine failed. He saw the gray bow of the destroyer looming over his men like the hand of God. He knew that if he had been facing a less disciplined captain, he would be planning 40 funerals today. Bagheri looked out his window at the tankers moving toward the horizon. He understood something that the politicians in the capital did not. In the Strait of Hormuz, the ships are the players, but the sea is the master. The water does not care about flags or ideologies. It only knows the weight of steel and the consequence of a mistake. He closed the video file and turned off his monitor. He had no desire to watch it again. Back on the USS Mason, the life of a sailor returned to its relentless rhythm. There was maintenance to be done. There were drills to run. The salt spray of the morning was washed away. The memory of the swarm was filed into the back of the mind, tucked away behind the daily requirements of duty. Commander Miller stood on the bridge as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple and gold. He thought about the two men in the water. He wondered if they were back with their families. He wondered if they knew how close they had come to becoming a footnote in a larger conflict. War is often described as a series of explosions, but more often, it is a series of choices. On that Tuesday morning, 1,000 choices were made by men on both sides. The choice to close the distance, the choice to lock a radar, the choice to hold a finger just a fraction of an inch away from a trigger. The USS Mason moved forward into the night. Its lights were dim. Its sensors were active. It was ready for the next encounter, whatever form it might take. The crew knew that the peace they enjoyed was not a permanent state. It was a fragile thing, held together by the professionalism of men who understood the true cost of their weapons. No missiles flew, no ships were lost, but history had shifted in those 20 minutes. When the line was crossed, both sides chose restraint. Modern warfare is decided not by who fires first, but by who chooses not to fire at all. The sea was dark now. The USS Mason was a shadow among shadows. The strait was far behind, but its lessons remained. The giant had been tested, and the giant had held its ground. In the quiet of the night, that was victory enough.